Do you think Alligator Records would have still happened eventually had you not decided back in 1971 to pour your savings into producing that first Hound Dog Taylor album?
I've never actually considered the alternative universe of having started later, but I certainly think that it would have been much harder if I'd either chosen a different first artist or if I had waited a couple more years because of what happened to commercial radio in the United States, even between 1971 and say 1973 or 4. But mostly, Hound Dog Taylor was just a perfect choice because he made people happier playing blues than pretty much any musician I've ever seen or heard.
Mm. Looking back, what do you think it was first about the blues that first attracted you as a young fella?
Well, like many adolescents, I felt kind of alone, kind of alienated from the world. I wasn't Mr. Popularity in high school, and I had my father had died when I was young. I had been kind of not had a lot of male figures around in my life, and I felt very much alone. And I remember when I first heard Mississippi Fred McDowell, which was in 1966. And I felt like, even though I was 20 in an auditorium, 20 rows away from him, I felt as though he was reaching out to me and just grabbing me and performing this music that was so much about both being alone and recognizing through the way the music communicates that you're not really alone, that other people are sharing your feelings. It just seemed like this music was designed for me. It was kind of like one of those moments in the movies when the light goes on, or the beam from heaven shoots down and hits you in the face, or maybe the rock hits you over the head, one or the other. But it really was a revelation to me, and I immediately became interested in finding out more about blues. And trying to get the one and only Fred McDowell record that was available. So I learned a lot about record distribution rather quickly. It took almost a year for my local record store to locate a copy of it. And I began to, as much as I could, immerse myself in the music. And I just found that, just like a wonderful meal, there's just more and more flavors, and there's more and more to consume. And in this case, it's 45 years of listening to almost exclusively blues and never getting tired of it.
Talk about your early days working at Delmark. What was the nature of your work there, and what things did you learn about the running of that label that you took with you to Alligator?
Well, I was hired as the Delmark Records shipping clerk. So I was working in the basement of the little, pretty grungy, dirty record store, the Jazz Record Mart, that Bob Kester ran then and still runs now. And Bob was and is a huge hero to me, a man who has never received the recognition that he deserves for being a groundbreaking record man, both in blues and jazz, recording musicians who never otherwise might have gotten a chance to be recording the first albums by working Chicago blues bands, recording country bluesmen like Big Joe Williams and Speckled Red, and also recording some very, very interesting jazz. At any rate, I was working for Bob, and I was packing boxes, I was sweeping up, I was stomping on cockroaches, I was occasionally typing invoices when the distributors would order. There were only three people working at Delmark: Bob's wife, who had just left because she was in the last stages of her first pregnancy, and me, and I knew nothing. Uh, I had done the blues show on my little college radio station. I had produced a couple of concerts at my college, one with Howlin' Wolf and one with Luther Allison. But my blues knowledge was, I look back and I think just how completely ignorant I was. At any rate, mostly I was doing, the grunt work, and that was okay. I was thrilled to be doing it because Bob owned that store, and because his label was known, and because there were so few recording opportunities for blues musicians dropped by the store all the time. So I got chances to, get to know not only the Delmark musicians, but other people who were aspiring to sign with Delmark. Somebody just showed me a picture of myself in the Delmark basement getting chewed out by Bob, which happened pretty regularly, and sitting there observing all this was Floyd Jones, the blues man who recorded Stockyard Blues and Dark Road back in the 1950s, and he's just watching us in amusement as we, as Bob kind of yells at me and I kind of cower in the corner. The things I learned from Bob, I learned two or three key things. Let me just start by saying, imagine me as just a college kid blues fan who talks his way into a job with a little Chicago blues label. And 6 days after moving to Chicago, because I didn't grow up here, I'm in the studio with Junior Wells, Buddy Guy, Louis Myers, Otis Spann, Fred Bielo, and Ernest Johnson.
Wow.
For the second session for Junior Wells' Southside Blues Jam. I thought I had been transported to heaven. I could not imagine anything more exciting than to be in their presence. Now, I wasn't in their presence doing anything artistic or contributing to the label or to the record. I mean, beyond the fact that when somebody needed to go out for sandwiches or for some alcohol or whatever, I was the guy to do it. And as it turned out, the first thing I had to go out for was to bail the bass player and the drummer out of jail because they had run a stop sign and whoever was driving didn't have a driver's license. So they were both locked up, and I had to drive in the middle of the blizzard to the police station in the Southside Black Ghetto and bail the guys out so they could come to the recording session. So that was an interesting learning experience for me right there. The way Bob did and does sessions is somewhat different from the way I've learned to do them or decided to do them. Bob is a real seat of the pants flyer. He makes records with the philosophy of what we tend to call 4 hours in a bucket of beer. Very often he doesn't know what songs are going to be recorded when the musicians come to the studio. If he's contracted a leader, very often the leader will choose the sideman, and Bob won't even know who else is playing on the record until they arrive. He lets the band leader have his head, and do what he wants to do. And when that works, it works brilliantly. For an artist who can improvise songs like Junior Wells did, even that first night, and musicians that are flexible enough so they can kind of find their way through these improvised songs and create something that complements those songs and makes the songs work. You can have brilliant sessions, and of course the great Delmark records like Hoodoo Man Blues by Junior Wells, and of course the two Magic Sam early Magic Sam albums, West Side Soul and Black Magic, and one of my personal favorites, even though it's kind of out of tune, Hawk Squat by J.B. Hutto and the Hawks. These are great records, and they're great because the musicians were doing what they knew how to do, and Bob stayed out of the way. But what I saw also was when it didn't work, it didn't work. What happened. The problems were too big. I'm sorry, I'm being a little incoherent because I'm not trying not to criticize Bob because Bob has his way of doing things. But I remember one record where the leader showed up with a rhythm guitar player who was a fine lead player but couldn't play rhythm to save his life. And the reason that he did it was because he owed a favor to the rhythm guitar player. And this was the favor. He got him paid for a recording session. Well, unfortunately, it was a bad choice of favors. So I decided early on when I was going to be a producer that I was going to be involved in the preparation of the record and not just the making of the record. So although when I recorded Hound Dog Taylor, there was no real reason to have rehearsal because it was a working band with their own repertoire of songs that were already worked out and they had their sound together, and there really wasn't much I could do to help them or focus them because they already knew what they were doing. But even as early as my second record with Big Walter Horton and Carrie Bell, I helped put the band together. There were a couple of rehearsals. I helped make up the song list, which then got discarded in the studio, and he did completely different songs from the ones he had rehearsed. And from that point on, I became more and more involved in thinking about the record and how it would work and what it would sound like, and trying to get the musicians focused on creating something that was more than doing what they already knew how to do and were already doing every night, stretching themselves, pushing themselves, writing new songs, not doing standard blues tunes, and doing more interesting things with the arrangements, and especially as so many standard blues tunes that maybe were unknown to the general public in 1968 became kind of familiar to even casual blues fans by 1978. It was more and more necessary that I either push artists to write good songs or find good songs for them to keep them from falling back on recording, Muddy Waters' greatest hits or B.B. King's greatest hits, which of course was often what they were performing in the clubs, because nobody stands up at a club and hollers, "Play something I've never heard before."
That's very true. It was
So there's that constant pressure on musicians who play in blues clubs to play something familiar as versus playing something fresh and new. And of course, those people who make records can say, I'll play songs from my albums. But for those who don't or hadn't yet, there was no incentive to write or to perform fresh new material. The incentive was to perform something familiar.
It was Bob's reluctance to record Hound Dog Taylor that inspired you to do it yourself. What were Bob's reasons for not wanting to take on the Hound Dog Taylor band?
Well, Hound Dog without his own band was kind of a disaster. It was really hard for other musicians to follow him. He had his own sense of rhythm. He had his own ways of starting songs. He had his own his own groove and sound. And part of it was that he worked much better with the bass parts being played on a regular guitar than being played on a Fender or an electric bass, because he needed a lot of action down below, because he was high up the neck with a slide, and of course a slide on the fifth of his six fingers. But he really liked that guitar bass thing, and there were only a few guys in town who could play that very well, because it was kind of an old style, and as electric basses had come in, playing bass on a six-string guitar became kind of a lost art. And to play what he liked with all the movement and the slid notes and the accents is just almost impossible to do on electric bass. So Bob had heard Hound Dog sitting in, and when people couldn't follow Hound Dog, he'd stop songs after a minute and try to start another song or tell a joke, or basically the music fell apart when he didn't have his own guys. So Bob had heard him in that situation and wasn't so impressed. And the other part of it was that when I came to him about recording Hound Dog Taylor, I presented it as, and this I had I had a lot of balls in those days. I presented it as I should be the one who produced the record because I knew the band. And I think Bob quite correctly felt, gee, this guy maybe doesn't have enough experience to produce a record yet. And, looking back, it's hard to argue with that thought. So I think that my involvement might have been a negative for him. But, Bob was like my dad, the dad I never had or didn't have after the age of 5. So when I started myself, of course, I wanted to prove to my dad that I could do it and that I could do it better than he could do it. So, there was a lot of sense of showing the old man what he ought to know. And, I was kind of an impudent kid at that point, I guess. And now I keep realizing what I don't know, and what I could still learn.
So what are your standout memories of those first sessions with Hound Dog? I believe you pretty much just recorded them as they were doing a live set basically in the studio.
Well, I co-produced with my friend Wesley Race, who was originally going to be my business partner, and that didn't work out because I had a tiny bit of money. He had a smaller bit of money, and at the last moment, he couldn't. He had another emergency and couldn't set his smaller bit of money free to invest in Alligator. But Wesley and I had made lists of every song that we heard Hound Dog do live, and we had broken them down into priorities. And so I was with the band, and I just said, well, let's try this one, and I set it up rather than using headphones, which would be normal in the studio. I set them up with monitor speakers, so it would be more like a live gig. And they played the same ratty amplifiers and the same cheap guitars that they played at the gigs. Ted Harvey brought his little Slingerland drum kit and his old cymbals, so we got a very raw sound. Hound Dog was playing through a Silvertone amplifier that was sold through Sears and Roebuck, which is a low end was a low end uh, mail order department store that also had some physical locations. So it wasn't like he had gone and gotten a Fender amp or some name brand. He had a Silvertone, which was kind of what you get when you're desperate to own some kind of amplifier.
Mm.
Two of the I think 8 speakers were cracked, so there was more distortion. And Hound Dog played on a $50 Japanese Kingston guitar. So as soon as he cranked it up, it was a wall of distortion. And that was part of the sound. What was funny to me is a couple years later, I heard Hound Dog borrowed a good Gibson Les Paul from somebody
Mm.
and somehow made it sound exactly like a $50 Japanese guitar. Of course, part of the secret is you just turn things up all the way
Yeah.
until everything is being overdriven. The pickups are being overdriven, the speakers are being overdriven, and you get heard, and it gives the music this raw sense of immediacy. So we brought them in the studio. We set them up in a row, just like they were at a gig. Wes and I think a couple of their friends who were there kind of created a little audience, so they had somebody to play to. And Hound Dog would sing. Hound Dog had bad feet, so he liked to perform sitting down. But he put on a better show sitting down than most people do standing up.
Hmm.
So he had the mic on a short mic stand right next to his head. And actually, if you listen to that record carefully, you can hear Hound Dog moving his head because when he's singing, he's blocking the sound of his amplifier from the vocal mic. And when he's not singing, the amp is coming. He moves his head away, and the amp is coming through both the amp microphone and the vocal microphone.
Mm.
So it changes the tone. And we tried to make it. I knew they couldn't overdub. They didn't think that way. And not only that, but I wasn't doing a multi-track recording. We were mixing it as we recorded it. It was direct to 2-track. So whatever was recorded was what it was. All we could do was raise or lower one side. And so I set him up stereo with Hound Dog on one side, Brewer Phillips, his wonderful other guitar player, bass guitar and sometimes lead guitar on the other side, and the drums right in the middle. It was just as close as I could get to a club gig at Florence's Lounge on the South Side without actually having the drunks dancing.
You operated the label out of your home in those early years. It must have been a chaotic scene there at times.
Well, I operated first out of a one-room apartment, and I had a piece of plywood and a couple of sawhorses for a shipping table, and I had a walk-in closet, which was the Alligator warehouse. It was on the 4th floor, and it wasn't unusual for the elevator to be broken and to have to haul LPs up or down 4 flights of stairs. Then I moved to a 2-room apartment in the same building, and then finally I got involved with a woman who was later what my wife and I call my practice wife, my first wife, and we bought a little rundown house together in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago, and that's the house where I still live today. We bought it in 1974, and I was warehousing in the basement and hauling LPs up and down the basement stairs, and I had a bedroom on the 2nd floor that I was using for an office. And originally, I was the whole label. And then over a period of time, I began hiring people. So eventually, I had 7 people coming to my house every day to work. Of course, it was not in a commercial area. It was completely against the law, but nobody was paying attention. I had a copier in my dining room. I had desks all over the place. And then as cassettes came in, my basement was full of LPs, so we began putting the cassettes in the kitchen. And eventually I had 7,000 cassettes in boxes in my kitchen. So there was a walkway, you could walk from the kitchen door, past the refrigerator and the stove, turn left at the sink and walk down to the basement. And that was the only space available for food preparation. Otherwise, it was all cassettes, 6 feet high. So I gave up finally, and I found a building very close to my house, and that's where I am now. I moved in here in 1985, and I think that's the last time it was cleaned.
So, was there a defining moment for you when it became apparent that this record label was going to be a viable, ongoing concern?
Well, you ask a good question because sometimes I wonder still if it's a viable ongoing concern. Certainly in the present climate, where people are stealing music left and right, and also where record stores are in, especially not as much where you are, but especially in the United States and in Europe, are in terrible trouble and closing very quickly, so that people are not finding music in stores. Um, I guess that I didn't really become secure until almost 10 years in, recording Albert Collins' album Ice Pickin', and discovering that he had a larger existing audience than I realized, and that we could actually sell some significant quantities of LPs at that time, based on the artist's existing reputation. Up till that time, I was literally making one record and trying to sell enough of it to pay for the next. And I've never had, I never had a bank loan. I never had an outside source of funding. So I started with $2,500, and I've made that work to finance this company for 39 years. And by the way, I should say, I never had a desire to be a businessman. The only reason I do business is so that I can be around the music.
Mm.
And if I could figure out some way to never do business again and spend the whole rest of my life doing nothing but working with musicians and hanging out at gigs, that's what I do. I've learned to be a businessman because it's the only way that I can make records. And that's what I love.
That could be the secret to your longevity too, I'd say.
Well, you know, I've never been. I won't say that I'm ungreedy or unselfish at all. I would say that I'm not very greedy for money. I'm greedy for other things. I'm greedy for the wonderful jolt of energy that this music can give me. I'm greedy for those moments in the studio when artists surpass their own what they perceive as their own abilities, where they deliver great immortal performances. Those moments when I'm out with my artists live and something happens, and they just peak, and they know it and the audience knows it, and you get very caught up in the moment of the audience being so excited about the music and the musicians being so excited about the music, and when I can help make that happen, that's very, very thrilling for me. um, and sometimes it's just the moments of musicians. Well, let me put it this way. Um, Recently, one of the musicians who records for me, and I won't say which one, um, was asked what he thought of me. And record guys often get a pretty negative rap from musicians, and
Hmm.
sometimes they deserve it. And this musician said, "What do I think of Bruce? Well, if it weren't for Bruce, I wouldn't own a house."
Hmm.
And I thought, wow, that's really saying something, that I managed to help create some kind of security for somebody who's in one of the iffiest, most difficult, least secure jobs that you could have.
Absolutely.
So it made me feel great.
Yeah. Talk about some of the wonderful acts you've brought to the label over the years. One of your most successful being Coco Taylor. Tell us about working with Coco. I believe she was a lady with a wonderful work ethic.
I'm sorry, say the last thing again.
She had a wonderful work ethic, I believe.
Oh, yes. Coco Coco grew up like so many musicians I've worked with, especially in the early years, grew up in the country. She grew up in Tennessee. She always said she was from Memphis, but she wasn't. She was from about 30 miles outside Memphis, in a little town near a little town called Bartlett. Tennessee. And her family were sharecroppers. You know, they didn't own the land. They worked for a share of the crop they raised. Her mother died when she was very young. She literally picked cotton, you know, and hoed cotton and grew corn and went out and picked berries to make into pies because they couldn't afford to get groceries. She was, by the time she was a young teenager, she was taking care of the white folks' babies. And as a young woman, she moved to Chicago, um, coming with her boyfriend, later her first husband, on the Greyhound bus, of course, in the back of the bus because those were segregation days. And as she said, with 35 cents and a box of Ritz crackers, you know, they arrived with nothing. And Coco looked around and she said, you know, this is exciting. I could. She said she thought she was in heaven because Chicago was so full of energy, and of course she hadn't seen, you know, the tall buildings and the big streets and the highways and all of those things. And she went to work in a laundry. She was a laundress, you know, and then she started cleaning houses and went began getting known in some of the richer suburbs and worked for various families cleaning their houses and taking care of their kids. And she used to say to me, you know, I spent hours on my knees and I wasn't praying, I was scrubbing the rich folks' floors. And she didn't resent it. Her husband worked two shifts. He worked as a cab driver for 8 hours a day, and then he worked at the steel mill for 8 hours a day. And you know, it was the American dream. It was people who were, I mean, Coco hardly knew how to read when she got to Chicago. It was people who were willing to invest their energy and their will to make it in labor jobs, jobs that didn't require a lot of training or, you know, academic type skills, to move out of poverty. And eventually she and her husband bought a little house. Um, as a matter of fact, the family that she was cleaning floors for and taking care of their kids guaranteed the mortgage so that they could get credit and buy a house. And all this time, you know, Coco was a huge blues fan. And her husband had run juke joints, you know, little rural bars out around West Memphis, Arkansas, across the river from Memphis. So he knew a lot of the touring blues musicians and a lot of the blues musicians who had come from the South to Chicago. He was a, you know, a familiar guy, and he was kind of a player too. He would gamble, and I suspect that at various times he may have had some ladies of the night that he was representing, so to speak, and he was well liked. So he would go out and take Coco with him, and he knew she could sing, so he'd suggest to whomever he knew that they let his wife sit in. And the Chicago blues bars are very casual, and sitting in is very normal. So Coco would get up and sing a song or two. And one night she was doing that. This would have been in the early '60s, and she sat in with Howlin' Wolf, and Willie Dixon was in the audience. You know, the great songwriter producer, and he heard her and got excited about her and became her mentor, often her songwriter, sort of her manager. And eventually, after she did one record for another label, one single, I should say, he brought her to Chess Records, and she had a number of good selling records. And by good selling, I mean they were on black oriented radio stations. And you know, in the States, we have a lot of radio that's, well, I mean, we have Spanish language radio, we have other foreign language radio, and then we also have, you know, country stations, and we have rock stations, and we have talk stations, and we have middle of the road stations, and we have stations that are very much beamed to the black communities in the big cities. That's where she was getting her airplay, not on mainstream pop radio. And in 1966, she had this huge black radio hit called Wang Dang Doodle, a song that Willie Dixon wrote and actually had recorded, produced versions by a number of other artists. Um, Coco, you know, went on the road and worked the Chitlin circuit, the black clubs in the South and the black ballrooms in the North for a couple years based on that record. But then Leonard Chess died, and the chess company was sold, and her relationship with chess just kind of dissipated, and she went back to cleaning houses, um, and sitting in, or sometimes she couldn't maintain her own band. She had a band in the 60s, but she didn't get enough work in the 70s. So she would come around and sit in as a guest, often with a musician who recorded for Delmark named Mighty Joe Young. Joe was a great guy and had become a friend of mine, and I would go to his gigs quite often and I would hear Coco. But at that time, Coco wasn't the legendary queen of the blues. Coco Taylor was a cleaning woman who was sitting in with blues bands in clubs that held 100 people. People, blues fans still knew who she was. She had some name value, but she wasn't touring. She hadn't recorded for a number of years. She didn't have her own band. And it was actually Coco who approached me because Hound Dog Taylor was gotten out of the ghetto and gotten out on the road, and was working very steadily. And I had worked with Sun Seals, and I'd gotten him out of the ghetto scene as well because there just wasn't any money to be made there. And Coco approached me and said, I know you're making records. I'd like to make records for you. I was pretty scared, actually. I had made 4 or 5 records at that time, and I had always worked with people who could both sing and play. So my band leaders could show the band what they wanted to hear. I'm not a musician. I'm not a player. Supposedly I have a good ear and I can express some ideas about music, but I can't say, why don't you invert to this chord at that point? Or why don't you move the beat slightly? I might actually say something like that. But I'm certainly not an arranger. And I thought a stand-up vocalist, a vocalist who doesn't play, is going to need somebody to really arrange the songs, and I don't know if I'm prepared to do that. So I knew I wanted to work with her because I loved her voice, and she had this wonderful stage presence. And I could also tell that she was a very straightforward person. Coco, in the 34 years that I worked with Coco, uh, first of all, I managed her. We never had a contract. It was always a handshake. We did contracts for the records, but that was because we wanted to both remember what we had agreed to, which is the best reason to do a contract.
Hmm.
She was one of the most honest people I ever knew. She never, ever missed a gig, except a couple of times when she was in the hospital as her health began to decline and she had to cancel. And she didn't not show up. She was forced to cancel some gigs. She was never late. Coco didn't drink, do drugs, smoke cigarettes. She was very, very serious about her music. And she considered it to be her work, not like a chore work, but this is like it was her mission. This is what she was born to do. She had very high standards for herself and her band, and she expected that she wanted to work with musicians and with management and with a label that had high standards for themselves. Um, I truly loved Coco. She was sometimes my mom. I was sometimes her dad. We were sometimes each other's best friends. And we sometimes wanted to kill each other. And we traveled around the world together. And, I like to say well, Coco would say, never curse the bridge that carried you across. And she considered me to be the bridge that carried her across.
Mm.
She died in what was it, 2000? God, 2009. It's been a year and a half, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, her health had gotten so bad that we were kind of amazed that she lived as long as she did. But she gigged till weeks before she died. The idea of retiring never crossed her mind. In fact, she talked about how much she hated sitting at home alone, not working, uh, just with nothing to do. The idea of taking it easy was just not in her.
Mm. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of talking to many of your artists, and one thing that always comes up in the interviews when the label is mentioned is that Alligator is a label that really looks after its people. Do you think that's something that really distinguishes you from some of the other labels?
I've always looked at this. I mean, because I came in this to this as a fan, I've always looked at the label as much more than a recording entity or a business. As I said, for how many years would it have been? About 13, 14 years, I was doing business where I lived. So literally every artist on the label knew where my house was or where my apartment was.
Mm.
I didn't have a personal phone. So I would answer the Alligator phones at any time of the day or night. And the artists knew that they could expect to reach me at midnight if they had a problem or on the weekend. And of course, at 2 in the morning if they were somewhere on the road and not getting paid, which happened now and then because I could threaten the club owners for them. I couldn't threaten them with Coco. Coco had a briefcase with a gun in it. Uh, but I couldn't threaten them like that, but I could threaten that I would get the word out that they were screwing an artist and they would discover that they couldn't book anybody else. That way I could threaten them. Um, I, I always assumed that the company would be more like an extended family than like a label. Now there are musicians with whom I have more or less business relationships, friendly business relationships, but business relationships. But there are also musicians. I mean, the other day, one of my musicians has a marriage that's breaking up. And the other day, I sat and listened to somebody talk about how much pain they were in from the end of their marriage and trying to decide if they'd ever get over it and how to move on. I about a year ago, I had a musician, a really nice person, a good father who had gotten into an argument with his teenage son and hit his son. He had never hit his son before, and it was 11 o'clock at night, and he called me up because he was so distraught at his own behavior that he desperately needed to talk to somebody, and he chose me. Somebody with whom he has a business relationship,
Mm.
but he felt that I would have an ear for him and he could trust me. I had one musician who was had a real bad drug problem and was desperately trying to stay away from drugs and moved into my house for a month to stay straight and sober. And when he asked, I didn't hesitate. He needed that. He needed a safe haven. Now, that isn't what I do every day. Most of what I do is normal business. But when the musicians call, I try to be there for them. Um, and I also try sometimes to be there for musicians whom I didn't have a business relationship with because the situations can be so bad for people in poverty. I mean, just literally um, this last week, I helped raise money for a funeral and a burial of somebody, a blues musician who died broke. And the family wanted a funeral, but there was no money for a funeral. And some of the money came out of my pocket, and some of it was from various foundations and charities that I've established a relationship with. And I had to raise about $7,000 in a couple of days, and I did so. And I didn't do it thinking, there's some business reason to do this. I did it because this music has given me so much pleasure, and 40 years of a career, and the least I can do is give back a little bit.
Mm. A lot of
I just
artists,
hate it that that's necessary.
of course, yeah. There was some artists that have had their careers completely turned around by being associated with Alligator. People that are in danger of being forgotten at some point. Coco being one. Lonnie Mack, another that springs to mind. That must be something that's you're particularly proud of.
I really like the idea that I'm a person who connects great musicians with their potential audiences. Whether it's somebody who's completely obscure, when I start working with him, like Sun Seals was, or like Little Ed was, or whether it's a musician who's had a career that's peaked earlier, like Lonnie Mack, or actually Albert Collins, who had no band when I started working with him. He was working as a single artist, going from city to city, hiring bands or working with existing bands. So his career had fallen on hard times. You mentioned Coco, and over the years there have been a lot of them. I mean, when I started with Lonnie Brooks, who's been with us, since the end of the '70s. Lonnie was working um, in a club on the West Side where he would do almost anything that was on the jukebox, occasionally a few of his own songs, and then he'd play behind strippers.
Mm.
It wasn't exactly being venerated as an amazingly creative, and soulful blues man. It was basically my job is being a bar musician, and it was it was a place where literally I remember some guy that was a scary joint. I remember some guy came in and came up to me, and I think that my girlfriend and I were probably the only white people in the place that night. That would have been pretty normal. And he said, "Will you do me a favor?" And I, with some reluctance, said, "Sure, what do you want?" And he said, "Hold this." And he handed me a handgun and turned around and walked out. And I thought, oh, good. Now I've got my fingerprints on what's probably a murder weapon. And I carefully put the gun down under my seat and hoped that he would return. And in fact, in about an hour, he came back and reclaimed his gun and thanked me and left. Uh, I was never in a club where somebody actually got shot, but I was in a club where some people got shot at and luckily not hit. Now, I got to say, most of the blues clubs were totally safe and nice. The street, not always so much. But the ghetto clubs were generally really friendly, neighborhood crowds, middle-aged people, usually Southern born, who went out of their way to assure me that it didn't matter that I was white. I was welcome there. Have a good time. Have a drink. Relax. We're all the same.
Mm.
But every once in a while, there would be an incident. And sometimes it was because I was white, and sometimes I just happened to be there. I remember helping Mighty Joe Young load his gear into his van on the street outside of the Riviera Club on the west side, and suddenly a guy ran past us, and another guy who was on the other side of us started shooting at the first guy, and we were almost in the line of fire. You've never seen three guys pile into a van quite so quickly as we did, but it's a little tough out there sometimes.
Mm. You brought Johnny Winter to the label at a time that when he was quoted as wanting to get back to his roots, and it's great that people like that saw your label as a home for the blues at the time. Have there ever been temptations through the years to step outside the blues area and promote other styles of music?
Well, actually, years and years ago, my again, my practice wife, my first wife, comes up in the conversation. She was a big reggae fan, and quietly, and it's very very much forgotten in Alligator history. But back in the late '70s and early '80s, I released 13 reggae albums, most of which were recorded in Jamaica by producers down there, and which I licensed for the rest of the world, or sometimes just North America. Uh, so yes, I experiment with reggae. I've done a few things that are blues related, but not clearly blues. Two albums with Lee Rocker from the Stray Cats.
Hmm.
It's roots music, but it's not blues. Recently, Anders Osborne, who is very difficult to define, but I guess you'd call him a roots rocker, as is J.J. Gray of J.J. Gray and Mofro, who actually right now is my best-selling artist. And not a blues man, though there is blues spirit in what he does. And then the couple of albums with Corky Siegel's Chamber Blues, which combine classical music with blues, and a few things like what happened with Corey Harris as he developed from being a blues man to being a sort of a pan African American music man. He went from playing Stone Delta blues from the 1920s and 30s to doing some pretty groundbreaking things involving Caribbean music and hip hop and blues and R&B within the course of 3 albums. I never saw where he was going. And then, of course, he left us and began doing reggae records, which was sort of odd to me, but it worked for him. Uh, and so, yeah, I've pushed the envelope a little. I try. I recognize that the people who created the blues that I love. The people who came from the South in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, like Hound Dog Taylor, like Sun Seals, like Lonnie Brooks, like Coco. Um, that generation or those couple of generations are are either elderly or gone. And the blues culture that was in the South, where people would go to their juke joint on the plantation, or to the roadhouse, or in Chicago and the other big cities where they'd go to the neighborhood bar with a blues band. um, and it was really community music, and pop music within the black community. That's changed. I mean, that's it's become an old form of music to black people. So the black community is not generating a lot of new young blues artists. I don't think that there's going to be another Hound Dog Taylor or another Sun Seals. There are a number of people who have consciously chosen the blues rather than growing up in the blues, who have done some very interesting and, to me, very emotionally valid things with blues roots. I mentioned J.J. Grey. I find him an extremely stirring, emotionally deep singer and songwriter, and his grooves are just funky and fun. He comes from Florida, and he grew up in soul bands, and there's a lot of Memphis soul in what he does, which is only a half a step from the blues. Um, so I think that he's validly carrying on the tradition in a certain way. I can't expect that the future of Alligator is going to be like the past of Alligator. I may
Mm.
have a few artists, somebody like Little Ed is very, very rooted. J.B. Hutto was his uncle. He grew up in the blues culture. He's a blues man through and through. He didn't choose it, it chose him. But with some of the other artists, they did consciously choose it, and they have more culturally in common with me than they do with Ed. At the same time, if they're making what I feel are emotionally valid statements that carry on the spirit of the blues, they certainly don't have to sound exactly like what's already happened.
Yeah.
Muddy Waters didn't, when Leonard Chess brought Muddy Waters into the studio, he didn't say, put down that electric guitar, you've got to sound more like Son House. The electric guitar was part of what Muddy was doing. Well, in the same way, music continues to change. Evolve is a funny word because that assumes it's going to from something lesser to something better, but it continues to morph. And I think there will be, if I have too strict a definition of blues, excuse me, excuse me, too strict a definition of blues, I'm going to run out of musicians to record who I feel are worthy of a national and international audience. If I have a broader definition of blues, I think there's good opportunity for me to find musicians to record. Hopefully, I mean, I've only been doing this for 39 years. I'm hoping for another 20,
Mm.
uh, you know, uh, or more. Jerry Wexler, the wonderful producer from Atlantic Records, was kind of a casual friend of mine, and I was on the phone with him one day, and I said, Jerry, why aren't you in the studio? And he said, well, I'm 80 something years old. He said, I can't work 12 hours anymore, I don't know if I have the stamina. And I said, Jerry, you've still got your ears. People, if you could do, 4-hour sessions, people would kill for the chance to work with you in the studio.
Mm.
And it's what you love most in the world. Don't stop. Don't say you can't anymore. Change the rules a little bit, maybe, but do what it is that you do best. I hope what it is that I do best is, as a producer, is incite musicians to give performances that will stand the test of time. There will be performances that they'll want their grandchildren or their great grandchildren to hear and say, wow, that was my grandpa, that was my great grandpa, and that music still stands, that music still works, that music still has soul. As far as what I'd like to do outside the studio is, I'd like to, as I said, connect musicians with their potential audience, help musicians find a way that they can bring their music to a public, and help the public be educated enough to get excited about that music. What I've done is not in the mainstream of pop music, and it probably never will be, and that's okay. I was never thinking I want to sell the maximum number of units. That's what we say in the record business. We don't talk about music or recordings. We talk about units.
Mm.
Well, I've been a guy who always was a music guy first and a units guy second. I want to sell enough units to make enough money to record music. but but we never ran into this whole money. It's money above everything else. And I should emphasize that Alligator's not just me. There's 16 of us here, and I may be the Indian with the biggest headdress, but I'm not the only one here who can ride into battle and kick General Custer's butt. Boy, that metaphor was really odd. Sorry about that. I don't plan these things; they just come out. I'm the chief, but I'm not the only person here who's making things happen.
Yeah.
I've hired people who love this music, who have great ears and huge energy, and get very little credit. Um, I want to be doing this and connecting musicians and their audiences. My people here under my roof, the Alligator staff, wants to do the same thing, and hopefully, if I'm not here to do it at some point in the future, they'll carry it on.
Yeah. You got the 40th anniversary coming up next year. If you were just starting the label out today, what chances do you think there would be of being able to celebrate a 40th anniversary in 40 years' time, given the state of the industry now?
Well, now you have to consider that I'd be 103 years old at that point.
Yeah, true.
So I think that likelihood is pretty thin. But beyond that, seriously, the business has changed so much, and in such negative ways. When I got into this, there were still a lot of people who were just above all motivated by the music. And I think that there are plenty of people like that on a grassroots level, but attempting to create national and international attention for the music you love, and making that happen is much harder than it used to be. Beyond that, partly because of theft online, and partly because of retailers being just idiots and thinking people don't want to buy CDs anymore, and partly because there are so many competing forms of entertainment. The music business worldwide is 42% of the size it was 11 years ago. Less than half. And primarily it's because people think music ought to be free, but they think musicians somehow ought to be able to eat, and somebody ought to be able to pay them to record, even though the music should be free. It's just the people who are downloading the music don't think that they have any obligation to the creators or the patrons of the arts, which to some extent, I guess, the record companies are.
Mm.
So the music industry has been decimated. Beyond that, blues right now needs a young champion really badly, and I mean a popular young champion. Too many of the musicians are, they're middle aged, they're older. They may be able to work up a great head of energy and do thrilling music, but if you're 17, you may have a hard time relating to them. We need somebody who's gonna fire up the public imagination. And so far, I found some people who are 40, but I haven't found some people who are 18, and that's what I'd like to find. Somebody who's 18 but with the soul of a grown-up.
Well, if anyone's going to find them, Bruce, I'm sure it'll be you.
I keep trying. I listen to so much, including Australians. I get
Yeah.
demos from Australia pretty regularly.
So,
Unfortunately, it's very hard for me to do anything with foreign-based musicians because I have to have tons of U.S. touring.
yeah.
It's just absolutely necessary.
So before I let you go, any special plans coming up for the 40th anniversary next year?
Well, this probably won't surprise you, but I'm working on a 40th anniversary double CD collection.
Of
And in
course.
fact, and of course, two for the price of one. And I'm trying. Yesterday, I was in the studio doing some subtle refading of some songs that have fade out endings so that I could manage to squeeze another 30 seconds and therefore get another song onto one of the discs. That my pressing plant tells me that I can put up to 79 minutes and 45 seconds on each disc, and I'm getting as close to that number as I can. Last night we got to 79:41 on one disc, and I think maybe 78.56 on the other. And, I don't know whether I'll be able to find another 45 seconds of music to slide in there. So I'm working on that. We have new records coming from Roomful of Blues and Marcia Ball, amongst others. Probably a new Little Ed, the Blues Imperials, which I'll get to produce because I always produce them. And hopefully a new Michael Burks, and I'll get to produce that too. We have one of our best ofs that we call a deluxe edition coming from Shamika Copeland in January, and a number of other things in the works that I'm not ready to talk about yet. Um, the last year, 2009, was very, very hard year for this company and for the music, those of us who record music professionally in general. This year has been marginally better. And if people keep buying music like they did this year, little companies like mine, if people like me don't mind working 80-hour weeks, and I don't, uh, can survive. Thrive, I don't know, but survive, yes.
Mm.
And and if I can survive, I'm going to keep recording blues and roots musicians whom I believe in, and I think will, as I said, stand the test of time.
Fantastic. Sounds like another great year coming up. Bruce, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Well, me too. And I'm very impressed. This is my first experience with Skype, as I told you, and I'm very impressed with how well it works. The fact that we just talked for almost an hour and it didn't cost you anything.
Not 1 cent. Crystal clear
Well,
sound too.
yes, and you're community radio, correct?
That's right, yeah.
So this fits right within your budget.
It does.
Zero.
Under budget even.
Yeah, and in fact, let me say this because I imagine, like much community radio, you get contributions or have subscribers. Is that correct?
Ah, yeah.
You know, we have so little quality community radio in the United States, and when I see the playlists from stations like yours, I think your listeners maybe don't know what a special treat they're getting by having radio that is not driven by commercial forces, but is driven by people who are burning to share music and share information with other people, who are fans. Uh, this is my long-winded way of saying, if you're listening to this and you haven't contributed to this station, you should feel guilty. And instead of buying an Alligator CD, you should send a contribution. Or maybe just do both.
That's right. Yeah, do both. Bruce, thanks again. Thank you for all the wonderful music you've brought us over the years, and hopefully many more years of it to come.
Well, that's my plan, and I look forward to meeting you next time I'm in Australia, or you're in Chicago.
That would be great. Thanks again, Bruce.
Sure, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.